The Supreme Court has thwarted Mrs May's attempted coup d'etat against Parliament, but MPs have now voted to give her the go-ahead, and we'll be proceeding soon to the committee stage of the bill. And if you've not already responded to one of the petitions going around, please ask our MP to support one particular amendment. We, the committee, will be meeting Mr Chalk on Thursday of this week for an exchange of views. Yeah, there'll be blood on the carpet, I think.
Not in my house.
And then we have Ted Malloch, who wants to be Trump's ambassador to the EU, who's already on record as saying he wants to destroy the EU. So as they say, we live in interesting times. Mrs May, meanwhile, has absolutely no plan of what to do. The Dutch writer Joris Luijendijk, who writes The Guardian, has already said, forget Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means exactly what the EU 27 say it means. So is this a meeting awake? Have we come to bury our campaign? No, quite the opposite. The Speaker of the House of Commons has said this evening he's opposed to inviting Trump to address Parliament. But more importantly, we have Jonathan Porritt with us today. He needs no introduction. If you do want an introduction, read the confirmation of venue. I find something very interesting on his website. It says, I've been in the world of sustainability for a very long time, so I'm familiar with those special moments of intensity that come along from time to time. And the referendum result on June 23rd has certainly produced one of those. Well, it certainly has. And now, Jonathan, you're going to talk to us about progressive alliances and the future of Europe. So, over to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Philip, thank you very much, and I'm very honoured to be the speaker at the inaugural meeting of Cheltenham for Europe. This is an important moment for people who care passionately about Europe and the values that Europe represents, and I'll come back to some of that in a moment. So I'm delighted to see so many people here on a wet February Monday, and thank you very much for making the time and the effort to be here, because this is really, for me, really important. And I think that what we now need to do over the course of the next 2 years is absolutely critical to the well-being of democracy here in the UK. So as Philip said, these are not just interesting times, they're actually really quite dismally gloomy times, if one can take a moment to stand back and look at just how awful 2016 really was. And for me, doubly awful, because 2015 ended in sort of moments of real hope about our ability to sort out big global issues through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement and all the rest of it. And suddenly we arrive in 2016 and things begin to go a little bit pear-shaped, and then they get more and more pear-shaped as the year goes on. And really we ended 2016 in exactly the opposite place in terms of lifting or depressing of spirits that you can possibly imagine. A bigger shift in one calendar year is really hard to imagine. So there isn't really any point trying to just be glib about that, just ignore it. It is our operating reality today. I'm not going to speak very much about Donald Trump this evening. You'll all be mightily relieved to know. That's partly because it's impossible to escape the bloody man on our media, and I thought I wouldn't expose you to that anymore this evening. And just in case anybody's here under false pretenses, expectations, I'm not going to talk very much about the environment either. I'm not going to talk specifically about the degree to which the environment is going to be in safe hands during this 2-year negotiating period, or at the end of that 2-year period, because honestly, it's all speculation. All we know is that it doesn't really matter to Theresa May. And we know that because when she gave her really important speech on this 2 weeks ago, there was not one single reference to the environment or to the CAP. And in the white paper, which was published last week, there is one paragraph. So for those of you whose life revolves around critical issues to do with the environment, with land use, with agriculture, don't have too high a set of expectations about how central that is going to be to our negotiating position in Europe, even though it is pretty critical. So I'm going to talk more about where we are now, the story that is unfolding, and where we might expect that to take us in Brexit terms. And then I'm going to elaborate that through a little bit of an insight, I hope an interesting insight, about what's happening more broadly around the so-called progressive alliance idea, bringing people together to think differently about the future of politics here in the UK. So on the Brexit front, we have a very clear sense now of what lies ahead of us for the next couple of years. We pretty much know how the nation sits regarding its own thoughts about this. I have to start this evening by urging you all to beware your biases in this area. You probably know that in early December last year, a YouGov poll demonstrated that around 68% of people are keen on Brexit, i.e. a larger number than was the case at the time of the referendum, not a smaller number. They are not at the moment depressed by what is happening or changing their minds. More people have moved towards the idea of a clean Brexit rather than anything else. So you need to take that into account, even as we celebrate the emergence of Cheltenham for Europe, which is one of something like 30 to 40 equivalent groups all around the country, and that all those groups are on top of all the groups that aren't necessarily affiliated to Britain for Europe. There are groups that have seized hold of wonderful titles like the 48% and all the rest of it, who are doing a lot of really good work around this. And if you look at that, if you just look at the level of activity around pro-European positions since the referendum, it's amazing. It's amazing. There is a lot of stuff going on out there. But whether it is enough to counter the deep sense of joy that very large numbers of people in this country experienced at the referendum result, I don't know. And the truth of it is that in Cheltenham, which is one of the most pro-European constituencies, towns in the entire country, we would be ill-advised to forget that frisson of joy that very large numbers of people felt on June the 23rd last year. Very ill-advised, because it means we'd be going into our normal self-reinforcing bubble of bias and prejudice about why it is that people vote one way or the other. And let's just dwell for a moment on what it was that drove that vote. There are many, many reasons. The one that I am most intrigued by myself is this notion that by voting for Brexit, for getting out of the EU, it would enable this nation to take back control. This is the UK equivalent of Make America Great. Take back control. Now, I'm sort of reflecting quite a lot on the irony of seeking to take back control by giving control to the current Conservative Party in a democratic system that is fundamentally flawed and dysfunctional from top to bottom. If take back control meant, for instance, that we were committed to getting rid of the House of Lords, which would be a pretty good start in my book, that we were committed to doing something about the insanely unfair electoral system in this country, the first past the post system, which causes massive perturbations all the time in our politics, then I would be up for that kind of taking back control. If we really had a generation of politicians who wanted to see more influence and power vested in local authorities and local government, I would be pretty keen on that kind of take back control as well. And I would also love the idea that taking back control might allow us to take away some of the power from the very large, unaccountable media tyrannies that dominate this country. And we should take stock of that, because even as we go into an arduous 2 years' worth of campaigning, we know what the media backdrop to that looks like. And more of that is becoming clearer and clearer, and I just can't help but reflect on the degree to which our Prime Minister now seems in many respects to have picked up both the language and the values of that right-wing media here in this country, to have picked up a lot of the cynicism that characterizes those medias. As Philip mentioned, the outrageously cynical campaign to deprive Parliament of a say in this spoke volumes to me about what this government really thinks. There's a deep degree of dishonesty still in everything this government is doing. It still refers to the fact that the majority of people in this country voted to leave the single market. Simply untrue at any level, simply untrue. And there's an extraordinary level of arrogance about what it is that we think the destiny of the UK looks like if we can't negotiate a deal with the EU over the next 2 years. That combination of dishonesty, arrogance, cynicism is absolutely, for me, the hallmark of the Daily Mail. And as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, the Daily Mail played a pretty influential role in the referendum campaign. So when I hear Theresa May, our Prime Minister, channeling a combination of Nigel Farage and Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, I get really worried. And if you want to put the two together, Nigel Farage and Paul Dacre, you've got Faker. And for those interested in communications on the Brexit story, for me, that deadly Faker combination is something we have to watch out for. So taking back control actually is a really big part of the deal. But did our narrative in the referendum campaign and since, did it really speak to anything of that kind? Did it really acknowledge the deep sense of disaffection in this country about the degree to which an unaccountable elite based largely in London and the South was really taking care of, mindful of the needs and interests of the majority of people in this country? I don't think we did. So let's not point too many fingers of blame before we think about our own story here. But at least, post the white paper, we are fairly clear now about what the options are for us, for all of those who care passionately about Europe, who believe that we are best represented in the world as a member of the EU, not just as part of Europe in whatever shape and form that might be, who believe passionately that Europe stands for the best and most progressive form of internationalism that we've seen so far in terms of nation states giving up something of their sovereignty to allow bigger and better things to happen across a much larger number of people. We know pretty much where we are now in terms of the next 2 years. And it sort of maps out a little bit like this. Either we just go with the story that Theresa May and her government, her troika of ministers, are going to be negotiating the best possible deal for the UK during the period of that time, which she will then at some moment present to Parliament, because the concession has now been won, that this will come back to the Parliament, but in what form is really rather important. And at the moment the idea is that that deal will come back to Parliament in the shape of take it or leave it. And if you leave it, then the UK will default to a completely different idea about its destiny in the world, a WTO-driven attempt to prove that we still are great by selling ourselves as cheap as we possibly can to the rest of the world. Oddly enough, that seems to be the view that Jeremy Corbyn espouses, is leave it up to Theresa May and hope for the best. There are one or two voices that are being raised inside the Labour Party that says that's really not very sensible and we need to have a rather different stance, which is campaign furiously and as effectively as we possibly can for a rather more intelligent Brexit. I don't like using the word soft, because soft is usually contrasted with hard. And for a lot of people around the UK at the moment, soft tells you something about softy southerners, and hard tells you something about hardy northerners. I know I'm going a bit simple on this, but trust me, a lot of communications around Brexit are very simple. And I want to hear people talk about an intelligent Brexit. We will leave the EU, I believe, at the moment. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the way in which we do it and the deal that we make in terms of the customs union, the possibility of a better point of access to the common market, to the single market, these are all things to be played for. And Keir Starmer, I believe, in Labour, is actively very involved in that and pushing a much more intelligent line than his party leader and most of the Labour Party, who seem to be completely discombobulated by anything to do with Europe at the moment. There's a third route, of course, which is that being argued by Tim Farron. The Lib Dems have rediscovered a sense of purpose in the world by virtue of suddenly rediscovering the passion that they have for Europe. And their route is very different, which is negotiate, 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 do the deal, take the deal back to the UK people. And allow people at that point, in the full knowledge of what that deal would then mean for all of us, allow the people then to have another vote, a second referendum. And the fourth and last deal, as you know, is the one that Theresa May is offering people, which is, she doesn't call it hard Brexit now, as you've noticed, she calls it clean Brexit. And she has already revealed, the negotiating hand of this government, that we will not be seeking to stay within the single market. We will not be seeking to stay within the customs union. We have essentially declared our hand before the negotiations start by prioritizing at all and at any cost the importance of being able to manage our borders in the way that we see fit, to control migration into the UK. And this is really the point that we've arrived at, that this concern that people have and this political priority that some people believe it has been lifted right up to the top of what it is that the future of the UK depends on. Literally more important than anything to do with our economy, anything to do with the cohesion of our society. And it is extraordinary to see that given away in that kind of dereliction of duty for the people of this country today and tomorrow. Now, please don't get me wrong, I am no absolutist defender of the four pillars of the EU. I have long had a problem with the free movement of capital. It seems to me that that has given massive unaccountable power to all sorts of very dodgy people and companies, and hasn't necessarily served the interests of the European Union as well as it might. I'm okay on the free movement of goods and services because by and large, through a well-regulated single market, I think that does work for the benefit of all people in those member countries. I am no great enthusiast, and this will, I suspect, be controversial with some of you, I am no great enthusiast for an unbending commitment to the freedom of movement. And I have often worried that the way in which that is stated as an absolute imperative from which there is no resiling or for which there is no negotiation is not helpful. And the truth is that people have been able to use that absolutist freedom of movement commitment to persuade huge numbers of people here in the UK to vote, in my opinion, against their own direct interests because of their concern about what a very heavy immigration story has done for the UK over the last few years. So for me, an intelligent Brexit doesn't mean parking the story about freedom of movement. It means opening it up to really intelligent discussion about what we need to do. How could we, from a progressive, civilized, liberal point of view, respond to the concerns of people in a country like ours and come up with a better way of managing migration into this country. I'm not talking about refugees now, I'm talking about economic migration. Big difference, often passed over, particularly by the bloody Daily Mail. But it is a big and important difference. And I'm no great fan of the fact that we should go out and seek talent from anywhere in the world to fill the jobs that it seems people in Britain can't fill for themselves. I call this an absolutely criminal theft of talent from many other countries around the world, who, in my opinion, once they've trained and provided people with the wherewithal to do those jobs in their own countries, should have an expectation that they will serve their country first and foremost, rather than simply up sticks and move to whatever country it is that might be able to provide a job for them. So I am in favour of what UKIP says, God help us, about the importance of homegrown talent, the importance of providing proper training for large numbers of people to fill highly skilled, critical jobs in this country. There is, for me, nothing worse than thinking that we couldn't train large numbers of people here in the UK to fill jobs in the health service and in social care. And yet all the figures that you will have heard last week is there's actually a reduction in the numbers of people coming forward into nursing schools here in the UK rather than an increase. So we're not very smart at this stuff. If we really want to create economic opportunity for people in the UK, we do know how to do it, and to do it in a way that doesn't deprive other countries of much of the talent that they have. So I know that won't be everybody's view. I know for some people, holding true to the absolutism of freedom of movement is a critical article of faith for the EU. I don't think that served us well, and I don't think it'll help us very much in the future. Not least because we absolutely need to be patient about what is going to happen over the course of the next 2 years. Nobody thought about what was going to happen in 2016. Nobody. Nobody really predicted how things might turn out in a referendum. Nobody really predicted how things might turn out in the USA. So let's have a little bit of humility when it comes to thinking about what's going to happen in the next 2 years. I fear a lot of it won't be good, incidentally. I fear there is now a genie released into the world of European politics, which is deeply scary, starting, no doubt, with Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, moving on from there to what is happening in France. And I couldn't help but watch a tiny bit of Marine Le Pen's speech announcing her candidacy for the president. This is compelling stuff, speaking to a part of French politics more effectively than most other politicians, with the exception possibly of the wonderful Emmanuel Macron, who we have to hope will do the dirt when it comes to dealing with Marine Le Pen, because Mr. Fillon seems incapable. And then think about some of the other countries that are very worried about the freedom of movement, though they don't know how to address it, Italy and Greece in particular. Think about the damage done to Mutti Merkel in Germany because of the decision she took, in my opinion, quite bravely, around refugees. There is a series of potential dominoes here which may fall. In which case the discussion about the freedom of movement is back on the table. And if there's a discussion about the freedom of movement, there's a discussion about what kind of involvement we want with the EU. So let's just be a little bit cautious about predictions about where this thing is going to fall apart, this negotiating period. Now, the backdrop to all of that is, of course, the woeful state of politics in the UK at the moment. And I do mean woeful. It does not gladden anyone's heart to see the principal party of opposition in complete disarray.
Rubbish.
I can't see any.
Rubbish.
It's not in complete disarray, or it doesn't gladden your heart?
It's not in complete disarray.
Okay, partial disarray. I'm demonstrating my readiness to negotiate and compromise, which is what we'll all have to get used to over the course of the next 2 years. Partial disarray. It cannot be good for raising up many of those progressive causes and issues that we care deeply about. It cannot be good that we will go into the next election based on the same first-past-the-post system, probably, unless there's an election this year, with a lot of changes brought about by the Boundary Commission, which will further strengthen the numerical strength of the Conservative Party, which means a Conservative Party UKIP stranglehold on the politics of this country for quite some time to come. So for me, what's happening around progressive political ideas is critical, which is why since the referendum result, I've been committed to taking forward a number of different initiatives around progressive alliances. And I stress this, this is in the plural, just like we now have huge numbers of organisations around the UK getting involved in pro-EU groups and movements like this, so there are a huge number of people for whom Europe isn't the top line, but working through some better way of engaging with the electorate at the next election is the top line. Progressive alliance, using the strengths of the three progressive parties, Labour, Lib Dems and Greens, together with the SNP and with Plaid, to see if we cannot find a route to a better representation of progressive voices in the next Parliament. This is growing. It's interesting for me to see how people are putting behind them some of their tribalism that they might feel about their much-loved political party. I'm a member of the Green Party and have been for more than 40 years, so I have to acknowledge a certain amount of tribalism on my part, but I can see how tribalism for the Green Party is of mighty little use at the next election. We have to do things differently. And there are two organisations in particular that are beginning to make a real mark here. The first is something called Compass, which is essentially dealing at the national level, or nations level, because it's also in Wales and Scotland, looking at what political parties can do to stop being so negative and destructive of each other in different election contexts. Right now in Stoke, for instance, where you would think the biggest single thing we can do is to stop Paul Nuttall being elected as an MP. Right now, the Lib Dems are taking chunks out of the Labour candidate as an expression of their astonishing political integrity. This is not clever. This is not clever politics. But Paul Nuttall's very happy. The second organisation is something called More United, which I am involved in as a convener. We're working more at the individual level. Our appeal is not to people in political parties. In fact, 80% of people who supported More United do not belong to any political party, but have chosen to support More United in a number of different ways. Not least by showing a readiness to put some money, some skin in the game, so that it will be possible for More United to work with candidates of all progressive parties to help contest